So for the past few weeks, I've been working on getting gear to swap my build from dual wand into dual sword and shield instead. And I finally managed to sort of finish it halfway, so I wanted to share my build today with you guys. And before I explain about the build, I just wanted to say beforehand that I'm mostly doing this for fun, and I thought it's pretty cool to wield two shields. So the build will be like a bit balanced between sustain and DPS instead of going full tank. So first thing first, I spend all of my stat points until I got the 50 strength for the 100 heavy attack chance bracket. And then I spend the rest for 40 perception for the 5% buff duration as well. I know that this applies for pretty much every other classes, but heavy attack chance is like your only reliable source of damage for this build, since most of your damage skills do terrible damage. Although at least most of your skills are like chip damages. So like they do multiple hits, which means your heavy attack chance will kinda proc more evenly. Buff duration is also pretty important since it will help a lot with your counter barrier uptime with its 5% base damage increased specialization. And your shot at victory buff also gives a massive 30% increase for sword and shield damage skills. And not just that, but perception also gives you more weaken and collision chance, which is very important since most of your debuff skills don't have 100% chance. And then for gear, I chose the Blade of Resistance as my secondary weapon, since it gives me a decent amount of HP and a whole 157 health recovery, which is actually really good in my opinion. And to make up for the lack of damage, I picked Azrael's sword instead of Karnak's, since it actually has the highest amount of base damage compared to other swords. Plus it also gives you quite a huge amount of mana recovery, so you'll have less to worry about when spamming skills. I'm working towards getting the Shock Commander helmet, but if you want like a cheap alternative, I suggest going for the Invoker hood, since it gives you a pretty high amount of cooldown reduction, on top of it having health recovery trait as well. I really like to use this Berserker Shroud for my cloak, as it gives me health recovery and hit chance, which is what I'm kinda lacking in this build. Plus, it also has buff duration, health recovery, and max health traits. And then for the chest piece, I also use Shock Commander to pair with the helmet, since it has the two-piece set effect, which gives 18 damage reduction, which will make you a little bit tankier when farming. I use Greaves of Resistance, since none of the purple leg gears gives me health recovery. Plus, it's also very cheap to upgrade the max health and recovery traits, since it's a blue gear. I'm also trying to save Lucent so that I can buy the Field General gloves, as it gives me a massive amount of heavy attack chance with the two-piece set effect, and it also gives perception and attack speed, so it's like the perfect gloves for this build and other melee builds in general. And while on the topic, I'm currently using the Field General shoes for the set effect as well. And the stats it gives are pretty similar to the gloves, so I think these two pieces are perfect. And also good for other builds in general. As for the necklace, I definitely recommend the Clasp of Conqueror, because it gives you the core stats for the build, which are strength and perception. I would also take the health recovery as well as buff duration for traits, since I need as much sustain as possible. I like the Forged Golden Bangle for the massive boost in health recovery, and it's also somewhat cheap to upgrade its traits. And following up are the two rings I use, which are the Granite Band and the Alabaster Band, which both gives very beneficial stats for the build, except the Alabaster Band having the extra stun chance, which we don't really need it. I also have health recovery trait on both of them, because it's cheap and I like it. And lastly, I chose the regeneration loop for my belt, since again, I want even more health recovery, and it's also a cheap upgrade. So pretty much I just try to get as much health recovery as possible, since there's little to no sustain in Sword and Shield's kit. I use this specialization setup for like a DPS focused playstyle, while having somewhat enough tankiness so that you don't just die instantly against certain boss attacks or a big group of mobs. Which is why I try to get literally every single damage boost specs on every skill, like Concentrated Barrier, which also deals 200% of your base damage when you recast it. And plus, you can extend the 5% base damage boost with this spec at the same time, if you're casted at the last second. And then I chose the Desperate Clash specialization for Fierce Clash, because it turns the skill into a knockdown instead of a super long distance knockback, which I kind of find it inconvenient when fighting against mobs. The reason why I didn't pick Annihilation Blade for Shot at Victory is mostly because it has this super annoying delay after you use the skill, which you would lose like 1.5 seconds of the buff after using it. So, since most of your damage skills have like 20 to 30 seconds cooldown time, you have to make sure to put every single skill on cooldown as fast as possible before recasting it, like Witty Strike or Annihilating Slash for example. With that being said, I usually start my combo with Shield Strike into Concentrated Barrier and Shot at Victory for the buff, Cleaving Roar, Annihilating Slash, Shield Throw, Witty Strike twice, Shield Strike into Annihilating Slash again, and then Desperate Clash. This will put pretty much everything on cooldown so that you can repeat the whole thing again to keep the DPS up. But just in case, if your Shield Strike somehow didn't debuff your enemy, don't use Annihilating Slash if that's the case, because that's like doing 40% less damage. Concentrated Barrier also deals 15% of your damage taken while having it up. So sometimes you can even purposely take the boss's mechanic damage to charge up your recast on Concentrated Barrier. As for weapon mastery, I picked the Collision Tree because it gives you the most value in terms of damage, like that bonus 12 base damage and 5% cooldown reduction,